Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He comes to us all the way from Lebanon. His name is William Van Wagenen. Last name spelled Vanwagenen. He's just published a book in August. Full title of the book is Creative Chaos Inside the CIA's Covert War to Topple the Syrian Government, which basically just happened in December 2024, so fairly recently. So much is going on in the Middle East, and he's right there. I read through the book. There's a lot of information that I knew, a lot I didn't know. But he also writes for the Libertarian Institute. I will pull up that website here in just a minute. But he also works with Scott Horton, who I've listened to so many times. I can't believe it, but Scott Horton's probably done 6,000 interviews, like incredible amount of work. But he just published a book, Provoked, about Ukraine. He's kind of doing the rounds as well. But as I said, this book, there's a lot of acronyms. There's a lot of confusing names. So we'll try to make those things clear. But there's some of the stuff I think people know, at least in the alternative media sphere. They kind of know of the conservatives and Wesley Clark. And some of that stuff we'll go over for people who don't know, but maybe get into some more of this details of this long-term covert war to topple the Syrian government, which has been toppled over and over again, by the way. There's been many, many coups, but William can talk more about that. So William Van Wagenen, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks. Appreciate you having me on.
So for people who haven't heard your name, maybe they're not familiar with the Libertarian Institute, maybe you can talk about your background, how you ended up in Lebanon, and then what led you to the research and writing of Creative Chaos.
Yeah, so I first started getting interested in the Middle East a long time ago during the Iraq War. Back in 2005, I spent some time in Iraq with a small human rights group and was there in 2005 and 2006 and have been, following things and about the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy, Israel, the occupation in Palestine, for over 20 years, I guess. And started writing really extensively about the Syria war back in probably 2015 for Scott Horton at the Libertarian Institute, as you mentioned. And, after all the research and writing, finally put the book together to kind of show basically what that war was really all about and how it started, what the origins were, what the purpose was. And to kind of cut through a lot of the propaganda surrounding, how it started and what, led to the war and how Syria was basically destroyed. And now, of course, it's the topic has become more relevant because that operation that was carried out by the CIA and allied intelligence agencies to topple the government of Bashar al-Assad, it was finally successful, back here in December. So this book covers the period, before the war, leading up to it. What were the reasons? What were the causes? And goes up until about 2015. And also really highlights the partnership between the U.S., Israel, and their other allies with Al-Qaeda. And again, the new president or the current president of Syria, as many of your listeners probably know, was a former Al-Qaeda member, an ISIS commander. And again, he's now the president of Syria with the strong backing and blessing of the United States, Israel, and so forth. So.
Sorry, my mic is muted. Jolani is his name. So it's pretty remarkable that this guy who's involved. But what a lot of people don't understand is that these outside influences, not just the CIA. CIA is there for sure, but all these other intelligence agencies, including Israel's, were using these Al-Qaeda fighters, right? These fundamentalist Islamists, right? Including Jolani, right?
Yeah. So, for example, it's always been Israel's policy to try to weaken, destroy, divide any Arab country that has a strong army that could potentially prove to be a threat to Israel. So that was a big part of what the Iraq War was about. Surprisingly, even this, 20 years after the Iraq War, not that many people know that basically the Iraq invasion that George Bush and the neoconservatives launched, that was largely for the sake of Israel. I mean, that was argued, years ago by Mearsheimer and Walt. But I don't think that message has really gotten through, that the Iraq war, that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was really done for Israel. And it's the same with Syria. And the same people who launched the Iraq war back in 2003, they're the ones that basically began the planning to try to topple the Syrian government of Assad and destroy and divide the country, which again, we're seeing now. So all that planning began, slightly, just a little bit after 9/11, where there was that, the plan to basically topple 7 governments in 5 years, again, for the sake of Israel. And all that planning began, way back then. So in the book, I just go through all that history. Richard Pearl, for example, a prominent Jewish neoconservative who led the push for war in Iraq, he was involved in a lot of the early planning to launch this war in Syria in 2011. And so that's, I guess, a really important thing to keep in mind, especially because, the mainstream narrative about the Syrian war that began in 2011 was that there was a dictator, Bashar al-Assad, and there were these grassroots protests of people, just trying to overthrow a dictator and bring democracy to their country. So in all of the Western press, that was the message that we got. And you got the message that these peaceful protesters throughout Syria were basically shot and killed by the Syrian security forces. Again, just kind of the classic case of a dictator trying to crush a peaceful democratic movement. But that just wasn't true. There are many Syrians, of course, that did protest for that reason. But alongside of that, many of the protesters, probably the majority, were Salafist, like extremist Muslims or Islamists who just didn't want a president who was not also a Sunni Muslim, because Bashar al-Assad was an Alawite. And they were receiving massive amounts of foreign money and assistance, again, from the United States, from Israel, from France, from the UK. And on top of that, there were all these attacks. Basically, these Islamic extremists within the protesters who would attack Syrian police and security forces to try to create chaos. And also they did it there are like many instances of false flags where people among the protesters would fire on Syrian security forces and even fire on other protesters, just to create anger among people and to give the impression again that there was this, ruthless dictator that was just killing these peaceful protesters. So this again was all organized by the CIA, the State Department, and again at the behest of Israel. And that's just something that to this day many people really just don't know.
They're not aware of all of these techniques that they've used. This is their famous story, regime change. They want regime change in Iran. They wanted it in Syria, and even regime change in Russia. This is the same thing, but it's a black bag of different things. AstroTurfing, it involves the internet, social media. Can you kind of expand on the techniques and things? The propaganda there's a black propaganda, but there's also these manipulations of what's really happening. Like you write in your intro to your book, they're spending $1 billion a year over this long-term, decades, right?
Yeah. So again, it was just a massive, it was a massive project, and they did have all these techniques. Maybe it's worth speaking about the Arab Spring as a whole for a moment, because that narrative that I mentioned about a dictator just opening fire on these peaceful protesters, that was the main narrative surrounding all of the countries that had these so-called Arab Spring protests. And the basic tactic was the United States and other would basically fund a lot of local activists. They would bring them to conferences like in Beirut or conferences in New York where there would be representatives from different tech companies. There was a guy at the State Department named Jared Cohen, who later worked for Google, who spearheaded a lot of this. So basically, they would train all these activists, put them on their payroll, teach them how to use things like Facebook, Twitter, to organize protests, to spread propaganda and things like that. And so that was a way that they could, foment unrest. But then on top of that, in all of the Arab Spring countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Libya, there were snipers in each case where there would be, in the early protests in any given country, people would be out there protesting, and all of a sudden, all these people would be getting shot in the head, with very accurate hits directly to the head. And there would be 10, 20, 25 people that would be killed in a protest, all by snipers. And no one really knew who the snipers were, where they came from. And immediately after many protesters would be killed this way, again, this happened in all of these countries. Suddenly, President Obama would come out and say, "Oh, well, this leader has lost legitimacy because look, his government is killing these peaceful protesters." So right on cue, there would be, again, protests organized using these techniques by U.S. and Western funded activists. Then there would be these false flag type killings with snipers. And then that would allow, the Obama administration to come out and say, hey, these people are not legitimate. Bin Ali in Tunisia, he needs to step down. Mubarak, he needs to step down. Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, he needs to step down. And then, finally, that process, or same thing with Gaddafi. And then that process, came to Syria as well, finally in March of 2011. And there was actually, this is also something not that many people know, again, thinking that the Arab Spring was this kind of grassroots effort to bring democracy to the Arab world. A lot of people don't know, again, that this was all planned by members of the Obama administration. There was a document called Presidential Study Directive 11 that was released in late 2010, just a few months before all the Arab Spring protests began. And that's where the CIA, the State Department, the National Security Council, different people in the U.S. government came together for a series of meetings to basically plan this new policy. And the idea was that they wanted to create transitions in these different Arab countries, basically to bring the Muslim Brotherhood to power in all of these countries. So again, that's actually, what happened in all those cases. And again, it happened in Syria as well. But in Syria, it took a slightly different form in that in addition to training these activists, having them plan protests, and then having some of these, false flag killings by unknown snipers. In addition, the U.S., they literally just organized an Al-Qaeda-led insurgency that would begin in concert with the protests. So rather than there just being the protests and some false flag killings, they literally brought members of Al-Qaeda from Iraq over to Syria to begin, again, attacks on Syrian police, Syrian security forces, just to create chaos and to, try to affect the regime change that they had planned. So they did that also in Libya, but that's something that they didn't do in, say, Egypt or Tunisia, for example. But they did basically get these Al-Qaeda groups involved in Libya and then also in Syria. And what's interesting in the Syrian case, as I mentioned, they brought most of these guys from Iraq. Some they brought from Lebanon as well, but a lot of them they brought from Iraq. And it's important to note that by 2010, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which by then was known as the Islamic State, it basically had been defeated. there was not much of an insurgency at that point, and most of the leaders of Al-Qaeda, which again became the Islamic State, most of them were sitting in a U.S. prison in southern Iraq called Bucca, and that included, again, probably, I'd have to double check the numbers, but a huge portion of the leadership of the Islamic State. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the later leader of ISIS, spent time in Bucca. And then Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, who again is the president of Syria now, he spent years in Bucca. And all of these leaders at different times, but most of them in 2009 and then 2010, most of them were released from prison in Iraq under extremely sketchy and suspicious circumstances by the Americans. And then again, by late 2010, even before the Arab Spring, quote unquote, protests began in these different countries, including in Syria, even before all those protests began, many of these Islamic State or Al-Qaeda leaders from Iraq had actually already been released from prison by the Americans and had gone to Syria to prepare basically for this insurgency. So these are other signs that all of this was planned, again, by the U.S. And I really want to emphasize that it was really done for the benefit of Israel. This was the reason that the regime change operation was planned and effected.
Right. So it goes all the way back even before the overthrow of Codify in 2011, right? And even they were moving these people around, these extreme radicals, I guess, that were conservative Islamists who were Sunni, right? Because Alawites are Shia. So that's like the big division in Islam, right? Is between the Sunni and the Shia. So you have these Sunnis who are always at the throat of the Shia, fighting against the Shia-run Alawite Bashar Assad and I forgot his dad's name, but the Assad family's ownership. But it is amazing that these guys are being moved around. Like you called it the Tripoli Brigade, and they all the Camp Bucca, you called it. You said it became a university. Like it's like what happens here in the States in jails, where guys learn certain criminal behaviors and then meet outside of jail. That's what happened with these guys too, right?
Yeah, so an American general who ran the prison, he actually coined that phrase. He called it the Jihadi University. It was the word he used for the Bucca prison in Iraq. And so basically they had all these guys in prison, and they basically allowed them to train and to organize. And then they released them and sent them to Syria to create all the havoc and the chaos that resulted. And again, you know, now I guess it's not as controversial, the idea that the U.S. actually, the U.S. and Israel both supported Al-Qaeda in many different cases. For example, that was even the case in Iraq. Again, the Israeli idea is, hey, we want to destroy these Arab countries that have strong armies that could ever oppose us. And if we can destroy these countries and break them up into like small parts or statelets based on ethnicity or religion, and if we can create sectarian civil wars in these countries, they will be weaker. If we can divide these countries, then we can control them. And so that was the idea behind the Iraq War. Again, like most people thought when the U.S. invaded, that the U.S. was going to do like nation building, that the U.S. was going to try to bring democracy to Iraq, that the U.S. was going to try to stabilize it. And I think, to be honest, a lot of people in the U.S. military, that was actually their idea. And that's what the mission that they thought they were doing. But the Israelis had other ideas. Their idea was to create chaos in Iraq, to have Sunnis fighting Shiites and Shiites fighting Sunnis, as you mentioned. And so that was how Al-Qaeda in Iraq began, is that intelligence agencies, the U.S., the Israelis, with the help of Iraqi Kurds led by Masoud Barzani, they are the ones that actually created Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The leader of that group was named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, but his job was basically to create a sectarian war. He was Sunni, so he would go out and do these suicide and car bombings against Shia in different parts of the country, like in Najaf or in Baghdad. And the whole purpose was to start and trigger a sectarian war, and that's what happened. So by 2005 in Iraq, the country was at its worst it had ever been, even though many Iraqis, of course, were very even happy when Saddam was overthrown. They were hopeful. They thought things would get better. They kind of believed the propaganda that the U.S. was going to make things better for them. But instead, the Israeli goal was to create a civil war, or sectarian war between the different ethnic groups, and that's what happened. So in Syria, the idea was exactly the same. So again, if you could, in 2011, have these protests begin, have some snipers doing these false flag killings against protesters and also against the security forces, you can try to turn people against the government, but also turn mostly Sunni protesters against Alawites, who are, again, an offshoot of Shia Islam that had a lot of influence in the government. And Bashar al-Assad himself was an Alawi, as you mentioned. So the U.S. and Israel were just using these al-Qaeda fighters, these extremist Sunnis, whose main goal is to kill Shiites and Alawis. They were using them as a tool, again, to try to topple the governments in these countries and also just divide them and make them weak. So.
Right, which has happened in Syria. And the thing is that, I mean, the propaganda to go into the Middle East was we got to go after al-Qaeda, right? That was after 2001. So that's kind of the trick, is that they're actually not, they're using al-Qaeda as a battering ram in these states. It's interesting. Al-Qaeda, they don't attack Israelis or Israeli interests. They only go after certain things, which I think is a huge tell. But they did there was all kinds of very, I would call it pretty sophisticated psychological operations and black propaganda to facilitate the breakdown of the Assad regime, right? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because like a lot of people don't know Dara and this background and like the use of Facebook in the Arab Spring and just to manipulate the people in Syria.
Yeah, so there were just, again, using these activists who were usually characterized as human rights activists or democracy activists. Many of them, in fact, were just members of the Muslim Brotherhood, but they gave off the impression that they were more like secular democratic activists. But they would always be, spreading basically fake news about massacres using Facebook. And then these things would get picked up by CNN. They'd get picked up by Al Jazeera. And, again, maybe they would even at times do a massacre, literally kill, a bunch of people, a bunch of men, a bunch of women, a bunch of children, film the bodies, and then, put that out on Facebook saying, oh, look what the Syrian government did. And then again, the Western and the Arab press would just pick up those stories and run with it and spread it all across the world to convince both Syrians that, the government was trying to kill their own people, and then also convince people in the West and in Europe that that's what was happening. Right. And the biggest example of that, if you want to get into, I mean, there are many examples of it, but the biggest example was in Ghouta in Damascus in 2013, where there was a major chemical attack. And if you'd like, maybe we could talk about that.
I think that went out into the media, and there was a lot of confusion, like a lot of the information, a lot of confusion, and a lot of contradictory stories about what really happened in Ghouta. A lot of people died. A lot of people were poisoned. Maybe you can give people a background and then what you think happened.
Yeah. So basically, the idea was that in order to topple Bashar and the Syrian government, the best way to do it, again, is to claim he's committing these terrible human rights abuses. And it doesn't mean he never did, do things like that during the war. In any war, there's, both sides are doing bad things. Not trying to say Bashar al-Assad or his army never did anything wrong, but the idea was that if you can create this impression, again, that this guy is so evil and he's done so many terrible things that we in the West need to intervene and get rid of him, this was the strategy. So you'd have this Al-Qaeda-led insurgency on the ground, but then do this massive psychological operation to blame Assad for a chemical attack. And then that would give the pretext or the excuse for the US, the UK, France to go ahead and intervene directly against the government, just like they did in Libya against Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. So after about 2 years of the war in Syria going on, by mid-2013 is when this operation was launched. And basically what happened is in August, the 21st of August of 2013, all of a sudden, early in the morning, there were just all these videos that went viral that were spreading online, and then again picked up by the Western and the Arab press, claiming that the Syrian army had launched rockets filled with sarin into different areas in the suburbs of Damascus. And there were all these videos showing all these dead people, kids, men, women, children. And they immediately claimed again that Assad had used chemical weapons, that he had used sarin to kill all these people. And as it turned out, and I give all the details in my book, basically many of the victims were really killed, probably like several hundred. Some estimates are even up to 1,400. But several hundred people, they really were killed, but they were basically taken captive by these opposition extremist Islamic groups that were enjoying support from the foreign intelligence agencies. They were basically killed, probably using carbon monoxide, like stuck in a basement, basically flood the basement with carbon monoxide, kill these people, and then drag them up into another room, line all the bodies up, film them, and then claim that they, were killed by a chemical weapon. And then again, that gave the excuse for the West and Obama to say, okay, hey, we need to intervene and basically launch this big bombing campaign against the Syrian government. So again, it turns out that was all had all been fake. The people really were killed, but it wasn't a chemical attack. It was basically again a false flag attack to have a pretext to intervene. Again, the details are complicated. I'm trying to think of how much detail to get into.
Well, it's sorry to interrupt, but it is interesting because the story that hit the West around that time, if my memory serves me, is that it was all done by the government and it was Bashar striking back, but it was all one big intel. But it had some interesting names involved in that around Obama's administration, right? People who are still in the news today.
Well, for example, maybe to go back just a little bit.
Okay.
In 2012, some Israeli advisors that were coming to the U.S. And visiting with like Hillary Clinton, for example, they started floating the idea that Bashar al-Assad would possibly use chemical weapons, and that would be a red line. And if Obama crossed this red line, if Bashar al-Assad crossed this red line of using chemical weapons, that would then, mean that the U.S. And other countries should intervene. So Obama then ended up saying that in a speech in August of 2012. He said, if we start seeing chemical weapons being used, then, that's a red line and we would intervene. So again, that basically created the incentive for these opposition groups, which again had their roots in Al-Qaeda or being led by Al-Qaeda, to basically try to, fake a chemical attack and get the West intervene on their side. And it also created an incentive for the intelligence agencies, against U.S., Israeli, Saudi, to fake a chemical attack, because again, it would basically force Obama's hand, where he would have to make good on this promise. So then finally, when this, fake chemical attack happened and all the videos spread, these were very, very shocking videos because all these people really were murdered. It just created this extreme pressure for Obama to intervene. But a lot of people were pushing for it. The Israelis were pushing very hard for it. Some people within Obama's administration were pushing hard for it, like Susan Rice.
John Brennan,
the CIA director, he was pushing hard for it. Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the Saudi intelligence chief, he was pushing for it. And it turns out that the opposition group called Jaish al-Islam that he was directly supporting, they're the ones that actually fired the rockets into the Damascus suburbs that did have a little bit of sarin in them to create the impression that a major chemical attack had happened. He was pushing hard for it. And again, I just want to emphasize the Israeli role. So all of these people, again, were basically conspiring, to create this chemical attack. And then at the same time, they were preparing by giving a huge amount of additional weapons to some of the Al-Qaeda linked groups on the ground for them to then invade Damascus, just as the Western bombing campaign was supposed to begin, as they anticipated it would begin. So it turns out that didn't happen because Obama basically got cold feet. He got worried about being blamed, if something were to go wrong by him ordering this major intervention. He knew it was illegal according to U.S. domestic law, also by international law, because there was no UN Security Council resolution authorizing it. There was opposition from Republicans in the Senate and the Congress. And so Obama ended up, backing off. He didn't want to get blamed for a huge catastrophe like Bush later got blamed for the catastrophe of the Iraq War. So a major intervention was averted, and Assad stayed in power. But what's interesting is that then the Russians, the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, as there was still a chance that Obama would order the intervention, he came to the Americans. He came to Secretary of State John Kerry and said, hey, why don't we do a deal? If we can get Assad to give up his chemical weapons, then why don't you call off this major bombing campaign? And sure enough, Kerry and Obama later agreed to that, and Assad agreed to that, and he gave up his chemical weapons. So what's interesting about that is that the Israelis, specifically Benjamin Netanyahu, they were extremely happy about that outcome, because Syria had developed chemical weapons under Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad, as a deterrent to a possible Israeli invasion or to Israeli nuclear weapons. That was Syria's answer, was having chemical weapons that of their own that could potentially stop an Israeli invasion. So by Assad giving up those chemical weapons back in 2013, per this deal that was facilitated by the Russians, the Israelis got a huge win. And they bragged about how happy they were with that outcome. But because the intervention didn't happen, Obama didn't order the massive bombing campaign to actually destroy the Syrian army, which would have been the Israelis' maximalist goal. Instead, they just kept the Al-Qaeda-led insurgency going, and they just kept sending weapons to the Al-Qaeda groups. Again, there's lots of different names like the Nusra Front, Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, on and on and on. But the basic idea is they were all Al-Qaeda type extremists. So Obama ended up authorizing just more and more weapons shipments to these guys. And they just kept the war going for several more years. And I guess if you like, I could try to talk about kind of what happened since then and then what's been happening more recently. But
yeah, please do. I mean, it's a dirty war that went on for decades. It's kind of also interesting. Maybe you also can add why Assad's response was what it was. He didn't. I wonder how effective he was. I guess would be my question to you.
You mean just after the chemical attack?
Everything, kind of his response to everything. It just seemed like they overwhelmed him, and he didn't have control over and he still does. He doesn't have control over. He didn't have control over the whole all of Syria, right? I mean, even the U.S. owned, I think, the northeast, right, where the oil was.
Yeah. So basically, as a result of all this, the country ended up getting divided. So just as the U.S. was supporting the Nusra Front, which was Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani's group, they were also supporting ISIS, which was basically the sister organization from Iraq. So ISIS took over large portions of eastern Syria and then western Iraq. And then Jolani and the Nusra Front, they took over northwest Syria, Idlib province. And then, so basically right there, the country was divided. And again, that's an outcome that Israel wanted. Then there was a push to then pivot away from supporting ISIS on the American side, pivot away from supporting ISIS, partner with the Kurds in the northeastern Syria where the oil fields are, and have them basically take over the areas that ISIS used to occupy. And then that would give the U.S. like permanent control of the northeast where the oil is. And then they continued supporting the Nusra Front and Jolani in Idlib in the northwest. And then Bashar ended up maintaining control of the country, control of the remainder of the country, but with heavy Russian influence over him. And as that, so anyways, that ended up in the country being divided. So Bashar and the Syrian government after that time was very, very weak and became increasingly corrupt. So once the fighting really ended in closer to 2018 and 2019, the Syrian government was spending most of its energy just kind of stealing money from people. The corruption just got really, really bad. And then finally in December of 2024, just last year, there was basically a deal that was done between the Russians, the Americans, the Turks, and the Israelis to basically allow Jolani, who had been there in Idlib, consolidating his control of these different al-Qaeda type groups. There was a deal between all these big countries basically to, let Jolani come in and take power in Damascus. And the Russians, who were supposedly close allies of Assad, could have done some things to prevent that from happening. Jolani's forces were up again in Idlib in the northwest. And the first city they attacked in late November of last year was Aleppo in the north. And the Russians could have easily stopped the advance of Jolani's men. They were traveling across these open highways from Idlib towards Aleppo, and then later towards these other major Syrian cities, and then finally Damascus. And the Russians could have easily stopped it, but they didn't, with airstrikes and things like that. So again, there was this kind of international, basically agreement to allow Jolani to take power, and that's how the government changed. Assad was taken to Russia, and again, Jolani has been in power since then. And again, if you like, we could talk about what's happened since December.
Yeah, please do. They cleaned up Jolani, right? I mean, this was a al-Qaeda fighter or this militant, and now he's wearing a suit and being traveled around Europe, right?
Yeah, and so again, even though he literally had been a former commander of ISIS and was well known for sending car bombs and suicide bombers into crowds of civilians, both in Syria and Iraq for more than a decade, almost for decades. There was an effort that began all the way back in about 2017 by a British NGO that was run by Jonathan Powell, who is now a national security advisor in the British government. And then Robert Ford, who was the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, was involved with this NGO as well. And they basically held a series of meetings with Jolani in Idlib and worked to rehabilitate or change his image. And again, cast him not as a terrorist as they had portrayed him in the past, even though they were supporting him under the table in the past during that whole time. But they tried to rebrand him shorten up the beard a little bit, put a suit on, as you mentioned. And so when Jolani took power in December, they changed his name. Basically, the British government, British intelligence, sent a bunch of media advisors that still work in Jolani's office in the presidential palace today. They sent a bunch of media advisors to, write all of his speeches, to script what he's supposed to say. Again, make him portray himself as this like great leader who was talking about, even though he was an ISIS commander in the past and, had vowed to commit genocide against Alawites and Shia. Instead, they had him giving speeches just after he took power where he's saying, oh, we want a future for Syria that's for all Syrians. We're going to protect the minorities. We're going to protect Alawites. We're going to protect Christians. But on the ground, exactly the opposite happened. A lot of people believed that propaganda, though. A lot of Syrians even, they were like, hey, we know his past, but, maybe he's changed. He's got a new name. He's called Ahmed al-Shara now. And again, he was just saying all the right things about unity and coexistence, and now Syria is going to be better. But basically, his security forces, or the terrorist group that he led that became the Syrian security forces, they immediately started a campaign to disarm Alawites who had been members of the former Syrian army and security services. They forced them all to come to these like reconciliation centers. And over the course of about 3 months, they systematically disarmed the Alawite community. And then in March, they launched this horrific series of massacres where, tens of thousands of fighters descended on the majority Alawite areas on the Syrian coast. And they just systematically went from city to city and village to village and started massacring Alawites. And they even filmed a ton of their killings and murders. They would just go into homes where people, again, had no weapons and just murder men, women, and children, mostly men, but all of them were unarmed. In cities like Banyas, especially in Latakia, and in a bunch of villages in the countryside. And the massacres were just horrific. But all this was, planned in advance, and it all was the exact opposite of, again, what Jolani said was going to happen when he took power in December. And
some of those made it to social media. Some of those videos did make it out to social media, but it's incredible what's happened there. And it's only getting worse. I don't know if it's really ever going to come out from some balkanized government. I don't think. Some people have said Syria will cease to exist. I don't think Syria on a map will be Syria anymore. Do you think so? Seem to have lost William here. We're at the 43 mark. If he pops in again, he's in Beirut and trying to do his best with the audio. The full title of his book is Creative Chaos Inside the CIA.
In the U.S. basically took no.
You're kind of dropping in and out, William. I don't know if you can hear me, but it's Inside the CIA's Covert War to Topple the Syrian Government. And again, check out the Libertarian Institute. I'll put a link to his stuff there and a link to his X account. The X account that he has is a good place to contact him, or the Libertarian Institute. And again, the full title is Creative Chaos Inside the CIA's Covert War to Topple the Syrian Government, and the author's name is William Van Wagenen, Vanwagenen. Thank you so much.